The ruthless millionaire forced the waitress to play the piano at a luxury party to humiliate her. However, when she started to play, she amazed everyone with her talent. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of the Blue Orchid, casting long shadows across the empty restaurant. Rachel Cooper moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, her sneakers making soft, squeaking sounds against the worn linoleum floor. At 24, she had the kind of quiet beauty that people noticed, but never quite remembered. Brown hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail, hazel eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and hands that moved with an unconscious grace that spoke of something more refined than serving coffee and eggs. "Table 6 needs their check, honey," called out Mrs. Patterson, the morning regular who'd been coming here since before Rachel started working 3 years ago. Her voice carried the gravelly tone of someone who'd smoked too many cigarettes and drunk too much coffee, but her smile was genuine. "Coming right up, Mrs. P," Rachel replied, tearing the receipt from the old register with a practiced flick of her wrist. The machine was older than she was, probably older than some of the buildings in this part of Manhattan, but it still worked. That seemed to be the theme of everything in her life: old, worn, but functional. As she walked past the small stage in the corner, her eyes automatically avoided the dusty piano that sat there like a forgotten memory. The restaurant's owner had bought it years ago with dreams of live music and jazz nights. But those dreams had died somewhere between rising rent and declining foot traffic. Now it just collected dust and served as an expensive table for customers' coats. Rachel had never touched those keys, not once in 3 years. Her left hand brushed against her apron as she reached for the coffee pot, and she felt the familiar ridge of scar tissue beneath the fabric. The crescent-shaped mark had faded over the years, but it was still there, a permanent reminder of a life she'd chosen to forget. Sometimes, late at night when the city was quiet, she could almost hear the echo of music that used to fill her world. But those were dangerous thoughts, the kind that led to sleepless nights and tear-stained pillowcases. "Rachel, sweetheart, can you help me with this?" Grandma Betty's voice drifted from the kitchen, tinged with the slight tremor that had developed over the past year. At 78, Betty Morrison was still sharp as a tack, but her body was starting to show its age. Rachel found Betty struggling with a heavy pot of soup, her arthritis making her grip unsteady. Without a word, Rachel took the pot and placed it on the stove, then wrapped her arms around the woman who'd been more of a mother to her than anyone else ever had. "You don't have to do everything yourself, you know," Rachel said softly, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and vanilla that always clung to Betty's cardigans. "Old habits, dear one, old habits." Betty patted Rachel's cheek with a weathered hand. "Besides, these old bones aren't ready for retirement just yet." But Rachel could see the truth behind Betty's brave smile. The medical bills were piling up, and Betty's Social Security barely covered her medications, let alone the physical therapy she needed for her worsening arthritis. Rachel's salary from the restaurant helped, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. The bell above the front door chimed, and Rachel looked up to see Mrs. Agnes Whitmore entering with her usual air of controlled chaos. Mrs. Whitmore ran the most successful catering company in the Upper East Side, and she had the kind of energy that made everyone around her feel slightly out of breath. "Betty Morrison, there you are." Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried across the restaurant like a trumpet announcement. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Betty emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Agnes, what brings you to our little corner of the world?" "Opportunity, my dear friend. Pure opportunity." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes gleamed with the excitement of someone who'd just discovered gold. "I've got the catering contract for the Nathaniel Brooks Gala tomorrow night, and I'm short-staffed. One of my girls came down with the flu, and I need someone reliable." Rachel felt her stomach clench at the mention of Nathaniel Brooks. Everyone in the city knew that name. Real estate mogul, philanthropist, the kind of man whose picture appeared in society magazines, and whose donations funded hospital wings. But there was something about him that had always made Rachel's skin crawl, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. "I don't know, Agnes," Betty said slowly. "Rachel's never done that kind of work before." "Nonsense. The girl's got grace, she's got manners, and she knows how to carry herself. That's more than I can say for half the servers in this city." Mrs. Whitmore turned to Rachel with a smile that was both encouraging and calculating. "What do you say, dear? $500 for one evening's work. It's good money. $500. Rachel's mind immediately went to Betty's pill organizer. Half empty because they'd had to skip doses to make the prescription last longer. $500 would cover Betty's medications for 2 months. Maybe 3 if they were careful. "What kind of event is it?" Rachel asked, though she already knew she was going to say yes. She had to say yes. "Charity gala at his penthouse, very elegant, very upscale. You'll be serving champagne and hors d'oeuvres to New York's finest." Mrs. Whitmore's smile widened. "Trust me, dear, it'll be an experience you'll never forget." Something about the way she said those words sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. But she pushed the feeling aside. She couldn't afford to be superstitious about a job that paid that well. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll do it." "Wonderful. Be at the Brooks building tomorrow at 5 sharp. Wear all black. Professional but elegant and Rachel." Mrs. Whitmore paused at the door. "Bring your best smile, Mr. Brooks likes his staff to look presentable." After Mrs. Whitmore left, Betty placed a gentle hand on Rachel's shoulder. "You don't have to do this, you know. We'll find another way." "There is no other way, Betty. You know that as well as I do." Rachel's voice was firm, but her hands trembled slightly as she untied her apron. "It's just one night. What's the worst that could happen?" Betty's expression grew troubled, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Instead, she pulled Rachel into another hug, holding her a little tighter than usual. "Just be careful, dear one. Some people in this city, they take what they want without asking, and they don't much care who gets hurt in the process." That night, Rachel lay in her small bedroom, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the city that never slept, through the thin walls. She could hear Betty moving around in the next room, the soft creaking of floorboards that spoke of restless sleep and worried thoughts. Rachel's left hand found the scar on her palm, tracing the crescent shape that had been there for 15 years. She'd been 9 when it happened, when her world had shattered in ways that a child's mind couldn't fully comprehend. The details were fuzzy now, mercifully blurred by time and the protective mechanisms of memory, but she remembered the sound, the terrible, grinding crash that had silenced the music forever. Her parents had been musicians. She knew that much. Betty had told her bits and pieces over the years. Carefully chosen fragments that painted a picture of love and loss without revealing the full scope of the tragedy. "They died in an accident," Betty said. "A terrible accident that left their little girl alone in the world, with nothing but a scar and a fear of the piano keys that had once brought her such joy." Tomorrow night, she would enter a world of wealth and privilege, a world that her parents had once brushed against in their own way. She would serve champagne to people who had never known what it was like to choose between groceries and medication, who had never had to count pennies to make rent. But it was just one night, and then she could return to her small, safe world, where the past stayed buried and the future remained mercifully unclear. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about the piano gathering dust in the corner of the blue orchid, its keys silent and waiting for fingers that would never come. The Brooks Tower pierced the Manhattan skyline like a gleaming needle, its glass facade reflecting the golden hour sun as Rachel stepped out of the subway. She tugged at the hem of her black dress, borrowed from Betty's closet and altered hastily the night before, and tried to calm the butterflies that had taken up permanent residence in her stomach. The building's lobby was a testament to wealth and power, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than Rachel made in a year. Security guards in expensive suits flanked the elevator banks, their eyes scanning every person who entered with the practiced wariness of those paid to keep the wrong kind of people out. "You must be Rachel," said a woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a clipboard that she wielded like a weapon. "I'm Sandra, Mrs. Whitmore's assistant. You're late." Rachel glanced at her phone. 5:03 p.m. "I'm sorry, the subway was—" "No excuses, mister. Brooks expects perfection from his staff, even the temporary ones." Sandra's smile was as sharp as her voice. "Follow me. We need to get you oriented before the guests arrive." The elevator rose silently through 47 floors, each passing second making Rachel's ears pop and her anxiety spike. When the doors finally opened, she stepped into what could only be described as a palace in the sky. The penthouse sprawled across the entire top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Central Park and the city beyond. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, casting warm light over furniture that belonged in museums. Waitstaff moved with choreographed precision, setting up serving stations and adjusting flower arrangements that probably cost more than Rachel's monthly rent. "Your station is here," Sandra said, pointing to a corner near the main salon. "Champagne service only. Smile, don't speak unless spoken to, and whatever you do, don't spill anything on the guests." These people don't forgive, and they certainly don't forget. As Sandra walked away, Rachel caught her first glimpse of the evening's host. Nathaniel Brooks stood near the windows, his back to the room as he spoke into a phone. Even from behind, he commanded attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a tuxedo that had clearly been tailored to perfection. When he turned, Rachel felt her breath catch in her throat. He was handsome in the way that powerful men often were, with silver threading through his dark hair and laugh lines that spoke of a man comfortable with his place in the world. But there was something else, something that made Rachel's skin crawl, despite his polished exterior. His eyes, pale blue and calculating, swept the room like a predator surveying his territory. "Everything looks perfect," he said to Sandra, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Where's the piano?" "Being moved into position now, sir. The movers assured me it would be ready before the first guests arrive." Piano. Rachel's blood ran cold as she watched 4 men in coveralls carefully wheel a baby grand into the center of the main salon. It was beautiful, polished ebony that gleamed under the chandeliers, its curves elegant and inviting. But as they positioned it just so, angling it to catch the light from the windows, Rachel felt a strange sense of recognition wash over her. She shook her head, telling herself it was impossible. One piano looked much like another, especially expensive ones. The feeling was just nerves. Nothing more. The guests began arriving at 7, a parade of Manhattan's elite flowing through the penthouse like well-dressed sharks. Rachel recognized faces from magazine covers and gossip columns, tech entrepreneurs, Wall Street titans, celebrities whose names she knew, but whose actual talents remained mysterious. They moved through the space with the casual confidence of people who owned the world, or at least significant portions of it. Champagne. Rachel offered her tray to a woman dripping in diamonds, who took a glass without even looking at her. It was as if Rachel were invisible, just another piece of furniture in Nathaniel Brooks's carefully orchestrated evening. She was refilling her tray when she noticed the couple by the windows. The woman was stunning in the way that money could make anyone stunning. Perfect hair, perfect dress, perfect jewelry that caught the light with every movement. But there was something hollow about her beauty, as if all the perfection had been achieved at the cost of something essential. The man beside her was older, distinguished, with the kind of accent that spoke of European boarding schools and old money. They seemed to be having an intense conversation, though their voices were too low for Rachel to overhear. "That's Amanda Brooks," whispered one of the other servers as they passed each other near the kitchen. "The wife, and that's Arthur Chambers, some big shot investor from London. Word is he's thinking about backing Brooks's new development project." Rachel nodded, filing the information away without really knowing why. She was here to serve champagne, not to eavesdrop on the rich and powerful, but something about the way Amanda Brooks held herself. The careful mask of her expression reminded Rachel of someone trying very hard not to break. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nathaniel's voice boomed across the room, commanding instant attention. "Thank you all for joining me tonight. As you know, we're here to celebrate the groundbreaking of the Brooks Cultural Center, a project that will bring arts education to underserved communities throughout the city." Polite applause rippled through the crowd, the kind of measured response that spoke of obligation rather than enthusiasm. "But before we get to the boring speeches," Nathaniel continued, his smile sharp as a blade, "I thought you might enjoy a little entertainment, Arthur. You mentioned at lunch that you were curious about American musical talent. Well, I think we can arrange a little demonstration." Rachel felt her stomach drop as Nathaniel's eyes swept the room and landed on her. His smile widened, predatory and amused. "You," he said, pointing directly at her. "The one with the champagne. Come here." Every eye in the room turned to Rachel, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. She glanced desperately toward Sandra, hoping for rescue, but the woman was studiously avoiding her gaze. "I said come here," Nathaniel repeated, his voice carrying an edge that made it clear this wasn't a request. Rachel set down her tray with shaking hands, and walked toward him, acutely aware of the whispered conversations that had sprung up around her. She could feel the weight of judgment in every gaze, the unspoken question of what someone like her was doing in a place like this. "What's your name?" Nathaniel asked when she reached him, his voice carrying easily across the now silent room. "Rachel, sir. Rachel Cooper." "Well, Rachel Cooper, I have a proposition for you." He gestured toward the piano, which gleamed like a dark jewel in the center of the room. "Play something for our guests. Something inspiring." "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't play," Rachel said quietly, hoping he would let her return to her serving duties. Nathaniel's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Nonsense. I can always tell when someone has musical training. It's in the way you move, the way you carry yourself." "Don't disappoint me, Rachel." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Wrapped though it was in silk and smiles, Rachel glanced around the room, seeing nothing but expectant faces and cruel amusement. These people didn't care about her comfort or her dignity. She was entertainment, nothing more. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I really can't." $500, Nathaniel said suddenly. "Play one song and I'll double your fee for tonight. Surely that's worth a few minutes of your time." $1,000. The number hit Rachel like a physical blow. $1,000 would cover Betty's medications for months, would pay for the physical therapy she needed, would give them breathing room they hadn't had in years. With legs that felt like lead, Rachel walked toward the piano. The bench was exactly the right height. The fallboard opened to reveal keys that gleamed like teeth in a predator's smile. She placed her hands on the smooth ebony surface and felt 15 years of carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. Because she knew this piano. Somehow, impossibly, she knew the weight of these particular keys, the way the sustain pedal felt under her foot, the slight imperfection in the middle C that made it ring just a fraction flat. This was her father's piano, the piano from the conservatory where she'd learned to play, where she'd been happiest, where her world had ended in fire and twisted metal and the terrible silence that followed. And Nathaniel Brooks was smiling at her like a cat who'd finally cornered his mouse. Rachel's hands trembled as they hovered over the keys, muscle memory warring with 15 years of deliberate forgetting. The room had fallen completely silent, the kind of expectant hush that preceded either triumph or disaster. She could feel Nathaniel's eyes boring into her back, could sense his satisfaction at having cornered her so perfectly. The piano bench creaked softly as she adjusted her position, and suddenly she was 9 years old again, her father's gentle hands guiding hers across these same keys. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Charles Cooper's patient voice explaining the difference between playing notes and making music, his laugh when she stumbled over a difficult passage, the way his eyes lit up when she finally mastered a piece. "We're waiting," Nathaniel said, his voice cutting through her reverie like a blade. Rachel closed her eyes and let her fingers find their positions. Her left hand still bore the crescent scar, now pressed against the cool ivory of the keys that had once been as familiar as her own heartbeat. She could play something simple, something safe, a children's song or a basic scale that would satisfy Nathaniel's cruel game without revealing too much of herself. But then she felt it, the ghost of her father's presence, the echo of his voice telling her that music wasn't about playing it safe. Music was about truth, about pouring your soul into the world and letting it resonate in ways that words never could. Her fingers pressed down, and the first notes of Corazón de Medianoche filled the room. The melody started softly, almost tentatively, like a whispered secret shared between lovers. But as Rachel's confidence returned, as 15 years of suppressed emotion found their voice through her fingertips, the music began to swell. This wasn't just a song. It was her father's masterpiece, a composition he'd written for her mother during their courtship, filled with coded messages of love and longing that only someone who'd lived with them could truly understand. The bass line rolled like thunder beneath the delicate treble melody, painting pictures of midnight walks through Central Park, of whispered promises and shared dreams. Rachel's hands moved with increasing fluency, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. As the story unfolded through music, she was dimly aware of the effect her playing was having on the room. Conversations had stopped entirely, glasses forgotten in hands that had gone still with surprise. But she was lost now, caught in the current of the music that poured from her like blood from a wound. The middle section shifted into a minor key, darker and more complex, telling the story of obstacles overcome and sacrifices made for love. Her father had explained this part to her once, how he'd written it during a difficult period in his relationship with her mother, when outside forces had threatened to tear them apart. The music spoke of determination, of two people refusing to let the world dictate their happiness, as the composition moved toward its climax. Rachel felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't care anymore about the watching crowd, about Nathaniel's cruel game, about maintaining the careful walls she'd built around her heart. This was her father's voice speaking through her hands. 15 years of silence finally broken. The final movement was pure joy, a celebration of love triumphant over adversity. The melody soared toward the ceiling, each note crystal clear and perfect, building to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. When the last note finally faded into silence, Rachel sat frozen at the bench, her hands still poised over the keys as if unable to believe the music had ended. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, came the sound of slow, deliberate applause. Rachel turned to see a man in his 60s, distinguished and impeccably dressed, walking toward the piano with tears in his eyes. "Extraordinary," he said. His voice thick with emotion. "I haven't heard Corazon de Medianoche played like that since." He stopped abruptly, his eyes focusing on Rachel's face with sudden intensity. She felt exposed under his gaze, as if he could see straight through to her soul. "Since Charles Cooper himself played it," the man finished quietly. The name hit the room like a thunderbolt. Rachel heard several sharp intakes of breath, saw Amanda Brooks go pale beside the windows, but it was Nathaniel's reaction that chilled her to the bone. His face had gone completely still, his pale eyes fixed on her with an expression she couldn't read. "That's impossible," Nathaniel said, his voice carefully controlled. "Charles Cooper is dead, has been for 15 years. "Yes," the older man agreed, never taking his eyes off Rachel. "But his music lives on, it seems. Tell me, young lady, where did you learn that piece?" Rachel's mouth felt dry as cotton. She was acutely aware that she'd stumbled into something dangerous, though she couldn't quite understand what. My father taught it to me, a long time ago." "Your father?" The man's voice was barely above a whisper. "And what was your father's name?" "Charles," Rachel said, the word falling from her lips like a stone into still water. "Charles Cooper." The effect was immediate and electric. Amanda Brooks let out a small cry and pressed her hand to her mouth. Several guests began whispering urgently among themselves. And Nathaniel looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Impossible," he repeated, but his voice lacked conviction now. Charles Cooper had no children. He and his wife died in that accident with no survivors. They had 3 daughters, the older man said quietly, his gaze never leaving Rachel's face. 3 little girls who disappeared after the tragedy. The authorities assumed they'd perished as well, but the bodies were never found. 3 daughters. The words echoed in Rachel's mind as fragments of memory began to surface. 2 other girls, slightly older, with the same hazel eyes and dark hair. Sisters she'd forgotten, erased by trauma and time. "I'm Lucas Bryant," the man continued, extending his hand to Rachel. "I was your father's friend and business partner. I'd recognize his composition anywhere, but more than that, you have his hands, the same elegant fingers, the same way of holding them above the keys." Rachel stood on unsteady legs, her mind reeling. She looked around the room and saw her own shock reflected in dozens of faces, but none more so than Amanda Brooks, who was staring at her with an expression of dawning recognition. "The scar," Amanda whispered, so quietly that Rachel almost didn't hear her. "You have the same scar." Without thinking, Amanda pulled off her evening glove, revealing her own left hand. There, on her palm, was an identical crescent-shaped mark, the twin of Rachel's own scar. The room erupted in whispers and gasps, but Rachel heard none of it. She was staring at Amanda's hand, at the proof that everything she thought she knew about her past was a lie. She wasn't alone in the world. She had family, a sister who'd been standing in the same room, breathing the same air, living in the same city. How touching. Nathaniel's voice cut through the chaos like ice. A regular family reunion, though I have to say the timing is rather convenient. There was something in his tone that made Rachel's blood run cold. This wasn't surprise or wonder. This was the voice of a man who'd been caught in something he'd hoped would stay buried forever. "Nathaniel," Amanda said, her voice shaking. "Did you know about Charles Cooper, about what happened to him?" Nathaniel's smile was razor-sharp and completely without warmth. "My dear wife, I know about a great many things, but perhaps this isn't the time or place for such revelations." Lucas Bryant stepped closer to Rachel, his expression protective. "Perhaps it's exactly the right time," he said firmly. "Some secrets have been buried long enough." As if summoned by his words, another man emerged from the crowd near the windows. Rachel had noticed him earlier. Older, with silver hair, and an accent that spoke of money and breeding. But now he was looking at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Arthur Chambers," he said, introducing himself with a slight bow. "Though I suspect that's not the name you're looking for." He paused, his eyes fixed on the crescent scar that Rachel had unconsciously exposed when she'd seen Amanda's hand. "My real name is Stanley Prescott," he continued, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "And if I'm not mistaken, young lady, you're my granddaughter." The words hit Rachel like a physical blow. Granddaughter. Another piece of the puzzle that was her past. Another connection she'd never known existed. She felt dizzy, overwhelmed by revelations that were coming too fast to process. But through it all, she was aware of Nathaniel watching her with those cold blue eyes, his expression calculating and dangerous. Whatever game he'd started by forcing her to play the piano, it had spiraled far beyond his control, and somehow, Rachel knew that made him more dangerous than ever. The golden evening light streaming through the windows had taken on an ominous quality, casting long shadows across the room, as if darkness itself was beginning to claim the space. And at the center of it all sat her father's piano, silent now, but somehow still radiating the power of the music that had just torn open 15 years of carefully buried secrets. The aftermath of Rachel's performance had transformed Nathaniel's elegant gathering into something resembling a wake. Guests clustered in small groups, their voices hushed as they processed what they'd witnessed. The revelation of Rachel's identity had sent ripples through the room that continued to spread like cracks in ice. Rachel found herself surrounded by Lucas Bryant and the man who claimed to be her grandfather, their protective presence a shield against the curious stares of the other guests. Her hands still trembled from the emotional release of playing her father's composition, and her mind struggled to process the magnitude of what she'd learned. "We need to talk," Lucas said quietly, his hand gentle on her elbow. "But not here. Too many eyes, too many ears." Stanley Prescott, her grandfather, though the concept still felt surreal, nodded in agreement. "There's a private study down the hall. Nathaniel won't mind if we borrow it, will you?" His tone carried the weight of old money and older authority. Nathaniel's smile never wavered, but Rachel caught the flash of something dangerous in his eyes. "Of course not. Though I do hope you won't monopolize our talented pianist for too long. The evening is still young." As they moved toward the study, Rachel glanced back at Amanda, who stood frozen by the windows like a statue carved from ice and expensive fabric. Their eyes met across the room, and Rachel saw her own confusion and fear reflected in her sister's gaze. But before either could make a move toward the other, Nathaniel appeared at Amanda's side, his hand possessive on her arm. The study was a masculine refuge of leather and mahogany, insulated from the party's noise by thick walls and heavier doors. Lucas closed the door firmly behind them before turning to face Rachel with an expression of mingled joy and sorrow. "You look so much like your mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Diane had the same eyes, the same stubborn tilt to her chin when she was thinking hard about something. "My mother," Rachel repeated, testing the words. "Betty told me she died in the accident with my father." "Betty," Stanley's eyebrows rose. "Betty Morrison, the nurse from St. Mary's Hospital." Rachel nodded, confused by his recognition of the name. "She's taken care of me since it happened. She's the only family I've ever known." Stanley and Lucas exchanged a meaningful look that made Rachel's stomach clench with apprehension. "Rachel," Lucas said carefully, "there are things about that night, about what happened to your family, that you need to know. Things that Betty probably never told you to protect you." "What kind of things?" Stanley moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the city lights. "Your father owned a small conservatory on the Upper West Side. Nothing fancy, but it was profitable and it served the community. Nathaniel wanted the land for a shopping development. When your father refused to sell, Lucas continued, Nathaniel made it difficult for him. Permits were delayed. Inspections found mysterious violations. Students were pressured to leave. Classic strong-arm tactics. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. You're saying Nathaniel Brooks destroyed my father's business? I'm saying he tried to, Stanley replied grimly. But Charles was stubborn. He fought back through legal channels, gathered evidence of corruption and bribery. He was going to expose Nathaniel's methods to the press. The night before the scheduled interview, Lucas's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. There was the accident. Rachel's legs felt weak, and she sank into one of the leather chairs. You think Nathaniel caused the accident? I think, Stanley said carefully, that Nathaniel Brooks has never let anything stand in the way of what he wants. And I think your father represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. The words hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and inescapable. Rachel thought of Nathaniel's smile when he'd forced her to play, the calculating look in his eyes when her identity had been revealed. Had he known who she was? Had this entire evening been some kind of sick game? But if he killed my parents, she said slowly, why didn't he kill me and my sisters too? Because 3 little girls disappeared in the chaos after the accident, Lucas explained. The authorities assumed you'd died as well. Nathaniel probably thought his problem was solved. A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Sandra, the catering supervisor, peered in with an apologetic expression. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Brooks is asking for Rachel. He says it's time for the evening's next entertainment. Rachel's blood ran cold. Next entertainment. He wants you to play again, Sandra said. For the formal dinner portion of the evening, he specifically requested another piece by Charles Cooper. The 3 people in the study fell silent. Rachel could feel the weight of their concern, their protective instincts warring with the reality that she was essentially trapped here until the evening ended. Tell Mr. Brooks that Rachel needs a few more minutes, Stanley said firmly. I'm afraid he was quite insistent, Sandra replied. He said to tell you that a deal is a deal, and he expects his money's worth. After Sandra left, Lucas turned to Rachel with urgent intensity. You don't have to do this. We can leave right now. And go where? Rachel asked. I signed a contract with the catering company. If I leave without fulfilling it, they won't pay me. Worse, they could sue me for breach of contract. I'll cover any financial losses, Stanley said immediately. Rachel shook her head. It's not just about the money. If Nathaniel really did kill my parents, then he's been living with that secret for 15 years, playing his games, attending his parties, pretending to be respectable while my family lies in graves he put them in. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, fury replacing fear. Maybe it's time someone reminded him that Charles Cooper's daughters didn't all die in that accident. Rachel, Lucas warned. You don't understand how dangerous this man is. If he's capable of murder, then he's going to have to live with the knowledge that I'm alive, that I know who I am, and that I'm not going anywhere. Rachel stood, straightening her borrowed dress with hands that no longer shook. My father wrote Corazon de Medianoche about love conquering adversity. Maybe it's time to see if music can conquer something else. Stanley studied her with eyes that reminded her painfully of her own. You have your mother's courage, he said finally, and your father's stubborn streak. But promise me something. What? Don't do anything foolish. Nathaniel Brooks has spent 15 years covering his tracks, building his empire on the bones of people who got in his way. One young woman with a piano isn't going to bring him down, no matter how righteously angry she is. Rachel nodded, though her heart was already racing with plans she couldn't quite articulate yet. I understand. But as they left the study and returned to the glittering party, Rachel caught sight of Amanda standing alone by the windows, her gloved hand pressed unconsciously to her scarred palm. Her sister, because there was no denying the truth of that connection now, looked lost and fragile in ways that had nothing to do with her elegant appearance. Across the room, Nathaniel held court with a group of investors, his laughter carrying over the soft jazz that had replaced the silence following Rachel's performance. But his eyes kept finding her in the crowd, tracking her movements with predatory precision. Rachel realized that this evening had become something far more complex than a simple catering job. She was walking a tightrope over an abyss of family secrets and buried crimes. with a man who'd proven capable of murder watching her every step. But she was also no longer alone. She had a grandfather who'd spent 15 years looking for her, a family friend who remembered her father with love and respect. And somewhere in this golden cage of wealth and privilege, a sister who was just beginning to remember that she'd once had a different name. The piano still dominated the center of the room, waiting for her return, and Rachel found herself looking forward to the next performance, because this time she knew exactly what song she was going to play. The formal dinner had been a carefully choreographed dance of wealth and power, with Rachel moving between tables like a ghost haunting her own past. Every time she served champagne or cleared plates, she felt Nathaniel's eyes tracking her movements, and the weight of his attention was becoming unbearable. Now, as the evening wound toward its conclusion, she found herself once again at the piano, but this time was different. This time, she knew exactly who was watching and why. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nathaniel announced, his voice carrying easily across the dining room, "our talented pianist has agreed to grace us with one final performance. Another composition by the late Charles Cooper, I believe." Rachel's fingers found the keys without conscious thought, but instead of her father's gentle melodies, she began to play something darker, more complex. The music that flowed from the piano was Recuerdos Perdidos, Lost Memories, a piece her father had written during one of his darkest periods. When financial pressures had threatened to close the conservatory, the melody was haunting, filled with minor keys and unexpected progressions that spoke of dreams deferred and hope struggling against despair. But woven through the melancholy were threads of defiance, notes that rang out like battle cries against an uncaring world. As she played, Rachel watched the room's reaction. Most of the guests seemed entranced by the music's complexity, but she was focused on three faces in particular. Lucas sat at the edge of his chair, his expression tense with recognition and concern. Stanley, her grandfather, watched with tears streaming down his cheeks, lost in memories she could only imagine. But it was Amanda's reaction that broke Rachel's heart. Her sister had gone completely pale, one hand pressed to her temple as if fighting a massive headache, and as the music swelled toward its climax, Amanda suddenly stood and rushed from the room, leaving behind whispers and concerned murmurs. Rachel finished the piece and stood from the piano bench, her decision made. "Excuse me," she said to the room at large, ignoring protocol entirely. "I need some air." She found Amanda on the terrace, gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The city spread out below them like a carpet of stars. But Amanda seemed oblivious to the view. "The music," Amanda said without turning around. "It's bringing back things I'd forgotten, things I thought I'd lost forever." Rachel approached carefully, as if Amanda were a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "What kind of things? Flashes? Images? A man with gentle hands teaching me to play piano? A woman with kind eyes singing lullabies, and two other girls?" Amanda finally turned to face Rachel, her perfectly applied makeup streaked with tears. "I remember two other girls, younger than me, but we were always together. Always." "What happened to you after the accident?" Rachel asked gently. Amanda's laugh was bitter. "I was adopted by the Ashfords, socialites who wanted a daughter to accessorize their perfect life. They changed my name, gave me a new identity, and told me to forget everything that came before. Said it would be healthier that way. So you became Amanda Ashford, and then Amanda Brooks when I married Nathaniel 5 years ago." Amanda's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "God, Rachel, if we're really sisters, if our father really was Charles Cooper, then I married the man who killed our parents." Rachel finished quietly. The words hung between them like a physical presence. Amanda wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warm evening air. "He doesn't know," she said suddenly. "Nathaniel doesn't know who I really am. He just saw a beautiful socialite who would make the perfect trophy wife, someone with no inconvenient family connections or embarrassing past." "Are you sure he doesn't know?" Amanda considered this, her brow furrowed in concentration. I don't think so. But lately, there have been things. Phone calls he takes in private, meetings he won't discuss, and sometimes I catch him watching me with this look." She shuddered, like he's trying to figure out a puzzle. Before Rachel could respond, the terrace door opened and Nathaniel himself stepped outside. His smile was perfectly calibrated, but there was something predatory in his eyes as he took in the scene. "There you are, darling," he said to Amanda, his tone warm with concern. "You left so suddenly, I was worried you might be feeling unwell." "Just needed some air," Amanda replied, her voice steady despite the tears still evident on her cheeks. Nathaniel's gaze shifted to Rachel, and she felt like a mouse being studied by a particularly intelligent cat. "And you, Miss Cooper, quite the evening for revelations, wasn't it?" The way he said her last name made Rachel's skin crawl. There was recognition there, and something that might have been amusement. "It has been enlightening," Rachel said carefully. "I imagine it has." Nathaniel moved closer, and Rachel caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something that reminded her of hospitals, antiseptic and cold. "Tell me, do you plan to continue your musical career? I know several venue owners who might be interested in booking someone with your unique repertoire." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Rachel felt her spine straighten with defiance. "I haven't decided yet, but I'm sure my father would want his music to be heard." "Your father?" Nathaniel repeated, his smile never wavering. "Yes. Charles Cooper was quite the composer. Tragic, really, how his life ended. Such a waste of talent." Amanda made a small sound of distress, and Nathaniel immediately turned his attention to her. "Darling, you really don't look well. Perhaps we should call it an evening." "No," Amanda said quickly. "I'm fine, just tired." But Rachel could see the fear in her sister's eyes. The way she instinctively moved away from Nathaniel's reaching hand. How long had Amanda been married to this man without knowing what he was capable of? How many nights had she shared a bed with her parents' killer? "Actually," Rachel said, surprised by her own boldness, "I was hoping Amanda and I could talk a bit more. About music, about our shared interests." Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "How thoughtful. But I'm afraid Amanda has a busy day tomorrow. Board meetings, charity luncheons. You know how it is." "Of course," Rachel said, but she was looking directly at Amanda. "Perhaps another time, when you're feeling more yourself." The message was clear, and Amanda's slight nod told Rachel it had been received. They would find a way to meet again, away from Nathaniel's watchful presence. "Well then," Nathaniel said, clapping his hands together with false joviality, "I suppose this brings our evening to a close, Rachel. It's been absolutely fascinating meeting you. I do hope we'll see each other again soon." There was something in his tone that made the words sound less like a hope and more like a promise or a threat. As they prepared to leave the terrace, a new voice interrupted them. "Nathaniel, there you are." Lucas Bryant appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "I was hoping to have a word with you about the Cooper Conservatory building." Nathaniel's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and dangerous beneath. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Lucas, of course you do. The building on West 84th Street that you purchased after Charles Cooper's death. I have some clients who might be interested in making you an offer." The tension on the terrace was suddenly thick enough to cut with a knife. Rachel watched as Nathaniel processed this new development, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and implications. "We can discuss business matters later," Nathaniel said finally. "This evening is about charity and culture, not real estate deals." "Naturally," Lucas agreed. "But tomorrow is another day, isn't it?" As they all prepared to return inside. Rachel caught Stanley Prescott watching from the doorway. Her grandfather's expression was grim, and when their eyes met, he gave her a subtle shake of his head, a warning. The evening was ending, but Rachel realized that something much larger was just beginning. The careful balance of secrets and lies that had held for 15 years was starting to crumble, and she was standing at the center of the earthquake. She thought of Betty waiting at home, probably asleep in her chair with a book in her lap. Sweet, protective Betty, who had saved her from the wreckage of her old life and given her a new one. But now Rachel wondered, how much had Betty really known about what happened that night? And more importantly, how much danger had they all just walked into? The next morning found Rachel sitting in the Blue Orchid's kitchen, nursing her third cup of coffee, and staring at the business card Lucas Bryant had slipped her as she'd left the party. The elegant script read, "Bryant and Associates, Music Publishing and Estate Management," with an address in Midtown Manhattan. Betty bustled around the kitchen with unusual energy, humming under her breath as she prepared the morning's soup special. But Rachel noticed the tremor in her hands was worse today, and she'd caught the older woman wincing when she thought no one was looking. "How was the fancy party, dear one?" Betty asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. "Complicated," Rachel said, then took a deep breath. "Betty, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Betty's hands stilled on the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the soup. "What kind of truth?" "About my parents. About what really happened the night they died." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Betty set down the spoon and turned to face Rachel fully, her kind eyes filled with pain and something that might have been relief. "I wondered when this day would come," she said quietly. "Hoped it wouldn't, but wondered all the same? So you know you've always known." Betty nodded slowly. "More than I ever wanted to, honey. More than was safe for either of us." Before Rachel could ask another question, the restaurant's front door chimed, and Lucas Bryant entered with Stanley Prescott close behind. Both men looked like they'd slept about as well as Rachel had, which was to say not at all. "Miss Cooper," Stanley said, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. "We were hoping we might continue our conversation from last night in private." Betty emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and stopped short when she saw Stanley. For a moment, the two elderly people stared at each other across the restaurant's worn linoleum floor. "Hello, Betty," Stanley said gently. "It's been a long time." "Stanley Prescott," Betty whispered, and Rachel was shocked to see tears forming in her eyes. "I thought, after what happened to Diane, I thought you'd disappeared forever." "I did for a while, but some things are too important to stay buried forever." Rachel looked back and forth between them, confusion mounting. "Wait, you two know each other." "Betty Morrison," Stanley said, his voice thick with emotion, "was my daughter Diane's best friend. They were nurses together at St. Mary's Hospital. And when my daughter died, when she was murdered," Betty corrected firmly, "Stanley blamed himself for not protecting her. He left New York and didn't tell anyone where he was going." The pieces were starting to fall into place in Rachel's mind, but the picture they formed was almost too much to process. "Betty, if you were my mother's best friend, then you didn't just happen to find me after the accident. You came looking for me." Betty's composure finally cracked, and she sank into one of the restaurant's chairs. "I was supposed to be there that night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your parents had invited me to dinner at the conservatory, but I was working a double shift at the hospital and I couldn't get away. The accident happened as they were driving home," Lucas added gently. "The official report said Charles lost control of the car on a wet road. But there were inconsistencies." "What kind of inconsistencies?" Rachel asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Brake lines that showed signs of tampering," Stanley said grimly. "Witnesses who saw another car following them from the conservatory, and a timing that was just a little too convenient for certain people who wanted the Cooper property." Rachel felt the world tilting around her. "Nathaniel Brooks. We could never prove it," Betty said quickly. "But when I got to the hospital and saw what had happened, saw 3 little girls who'd lost everything, I couldn't just walk away. So you took me," Rachel said. "I took you," Betty confirmed. "The hospital was chaos. The police were overwhelmed. And you were in shock. You didn't remember your name. Didn't remember anything except that you were scared and alone. So I brought you home." "What about my sisters?" "Amanda was taken by the Ashfords within hours," Stanley explained. "They had connections, money, influence. They wanted a daughter. And there she was, a beautiful little girl with no one to claim her." "And the third sister?" Rachel asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Autumn," Betty said softly. "The youngest. She was only 6, and she was difficult, angry, traumatized, lashing out at anyone who tried to help her. The social services system swallowed her up. But she's alive." "We think so," Lucas said. "Stanley and I have been looking for all 3 of you for years. We found Amanda first. Her adoption was legal and documented, but Autumn," he shook his head, "she could be anywhere, under any name." Rachel stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out onto the busy street. "Last night, Nathaniel Brooks made me play my father's piano, the actual piano from the conservatory. He's kept it all these years like some kind of trophy." "Son of a bitch," Stanley muttered, then immediately apologized to Betty for his language. There's more, Rachel continued. Amanda is his wife. She married him 5 years ago, and she has no idea who he really is, or what he did to our family. The horror of this revelation settled over the room like a thick blanket. Betty covered her mouth with her hands, while Lucas and Stanley exchanged grim looks. We have to tell her, Lucas said finally. Tell her what, exactly? Rachel turned back to face them. That she's been sleeping next to our parents' killer for 5 years. That everything she thought she knew about her life is a lie. How do you even begin that conversation? Carefully, said a new voice from the restaurant's entrance. They all turned to see a young woman in a professional suit standing in the doorway. She had dark hair and familiar hazel eyes, and when she smiled, Rachel felt her heart stop. Though I have to say, the woman continued, stepping into the restaurant and closing the door behind her, it's a conversation I've been looking forward to having for a very long time. Autumn, Betty whispered. Not anymore, the woman said, pulling out a business card and placing it on the nearest table. These days, I go by Danielle Foster, personal assistant to Nathaniel Brooks. And before you ask, yes, I've been working for him for 3 years, collecting evidence and waiting for the right moment to destroy him. Rachel stared at the business card, her mind reeling. Danielle Foster, the efficient woman who'd been taking notes and organizing Nathaniel's evening, who'd been present for every conversation, every revelation, every moment of the previous night's drama. You were there, Rachel said. You've been there all along. I've been watching and waiting and gathering proof. Autumn, Danielle confirmed. Did you really think I wouldn't come looking for my sisters once I was old enough? Did you think I'd just forget what that bastard did to our family? She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. 3 years of financial records, private correspondence, recorded phone conversations, and documented evidence of bribery, corruption, and conspiracy. Everything we need to destroy Nathaniel Brooks and make him pay for what he did. But if you've had evidence for 3 years, Lucas asked, why haven't you used it? Danielle's smile was sharp as a blade. Because I was waiting for my sisters to come home. Some vengeance is best served as a family affair. She looked directly at Rachel, and for the first time since the accident 15 years ago, Rachel felt truly complete. They were all here now. The 3 Cooper sisters, reunited at last, and they had work to do. Besides, Danielle added, I wanted to make sure he suffered properly. A quick arrest and trial would have been too easy, but watching his empire crumble piece by piece, seeing his reputation destroyed, knowing that his own wife was one of the daughters he thought he'd eliminated forever. That's justice. Betty stood on shaky legs and approached Danielle with tears streaming down her face. Autumn, honey, I'm so sorry. I tried to find you, but you saved Rachel, Danielle said firmly, embracing the older woman. You gave her the childhood I never had. That's more than enough. As the 3 sisters stood together for the first time in 15 years, Rachel felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Hope. They had evidence. They had allies. And most importantly, they had each other. Nathaniel Brooks had spent 15 years thinking he'd gotten away with murder, but he was about to learn that some debts could never be truly paid until the bill came due in full. The emergency meeting at Amanda's Upper East Side penthouse took place 3 days after the gala. In a living room that spoke of tasteful wealth and careful emotional distance, Amanda sat rigidly on an ivory sofa, still processing the earth-shattering revelations about her true identity and her husband's crimes. Rachel occupied the chair across from her, while Danielle paced near the windows like a caged predator. He knows something's changed, Amanda said, her voice barely steady. Nathaniel's been watching me differently since the party, more intensely, and he's been making phone calls at odd hours, speaking in code. Danielle stopped pacing and turned to her sisters. That's because I've been feeding him false information through carefully placed leaks, making him paranoid, making him wonder who he can trust. But we're running out of time. What do you mean? Rachel asked. From her briefcase, Danielle pulled out a manila envelope marked with today's date. I intercepted this in Nathaniel's private correspondence this morning. He's moving to liquidate several assets and transfer funds to offshore accounts. He's planning to run. Rachel felt her stomach drop. He knows we're onto him. Worse, Danielle continued, her expression grim. There's a second document, a proposal for asset management and disposal with a very specific timeline. I think he's planning to eliminate potential threats before he disappears. Amanda went pale. You mean us? I mean all of us. You, me, Rachel, even Lucas and Stanley. Anyone who could connect him to what happened 15 years ago. The room fell silent as the full implications sank in. Rachel thought of Betty, alone at the restaurant, vulnerable and unaware of the danger circling their small world. How long do we have? Amanda asked. Based on the financial transfers, maybe 48 hours before he's ready to move. Less if he decides we're an immediate threat. Amanda stood abruptly, moving to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. She retrieved a small digital recorder and several photographs, her hands shaking slightly as she placed them on the coffee table. Then it's time I told you what I've been recording for the past year, she said. Rachel stared at the recorder. You've been investigating him too. Not investigating exactly, but I haven't been completely blind to what kind of man I married. Amanda's voice carried a bitter edge. The calls he takes in the middle of the night, the meetings with men who look like they've stepped out of gangster movies, the way certain people disappear from his life after crossing him. She pressed play on the recorder, and Nathaniel's voice filled the room, cold and calculating. The problem with loose ends, Marcus, is that they have a tendency to unravel everything if you don't cut them properly. I've built this empire by making sure that doesn't happen. Another voice, gravelly and unfamiliar. What about the Cooper girls if they're really alive? Then they'll need to join their parents. Nathaniel interrupted smoothly. Some family reunions happen in graveyards. Rachel felt bile rise in her throat. The casual way he discussed murdering them was more chilling than any overt threat. There's more, Amanda said, fast-forwarding the recording. Listen to this one from 2 weeks ago. Nathaniel's voice again. I want you to look into Betty Morrison. Quiet surveillance, nothing obvious. And if you find any connections to the Cooper family, you know what to do. The recorder clicked off, leaving behind a silence heavy with implications. Rachel's hands clenched into fists as fury and terror warred in her chest. He's been planning this, she whispered. How long has he been planning this? Probably since the moment Lucas Bryant mentioned your father's name at the party, Danielle said grimly. Nathaniel's survived this long by being 3 steps ahead of everyone else. But now he's made a mistake, Amanda finished. He's threatened the wrong people, and he's underestimated who he's dealing with. Danielle smiled, and it was sharp enough to cut glass. Exactly, because what he doesn't know is that his trusted assistant has been documenting his crimes for 3 years. His wife has been recording his confessions for 1 year, and his victims' daughters have just reunited with a very specific goal in mind. Revenge, Rachel said. Justice, Amanda corrected. There's a difference. Before anyone could respond, Amanda's phone buzzed with a text message. Her face went white as she read it. He's coming home early, she said. He's supposed to be in meetings all afternoon, but he just texted that he'll be here in 30 minutes. Danielle was already moving toward the door. I need to get back to the office before he realizes I'm gone. Rachel, do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? The restaurant. Betty's there. No. Amanda's voice was firm. Absolutely not. If he's planning to move against you, that's the first place he'll look. Then where? Stanley Prescott's voice came from the penthouse's entrance hall. With me, I have a secure apartment that's not connected to any of my known identities. They turned to see Stanley and Lucas entering the living room, both men looking like they'd aged years in the past few days. How did you get in? Amanda asked. Your doorman knows me from various charity functions, Stanley explained. I told him I was here to discuss a donation to your pet literacy program. Lucas was studying the photographs Amanda had placed on the table. Are these what I think they are? Bank transfer records, shipping manifests, and correspondence with some very unsavory characters, Amanda confirmed. I've been keeping copies of everything that seemed suspicious. Smart girl, Stanley said with pride. Your mother would be proud of how all 3 of you turned out. Our mother, Danielle corrected quietly, would want us to finish what our father started. He died trying to expose Nathaniel's corruption. Maybe it's time we succeeded where he couldn't. The weight of 15 years of injustice seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. Rachel thought of her father's hands guiding hers across piano keys, of his gentle voice explaining that music was about more than notes on a page. It was about truth, about expressing what words couldn't capture. There's something else, Amanda said suddenly. Something I've never told anyone. She moved to a hidden panel behind a painting and retrieved a small key from another locked drawer. She pulled out a sealed envelope yellowed with age. I found this in Nathaniel's private safe 2 years ago. It's addressed to the Cooper family in handwriting. I didn't recognize then, but she looked at Danielle and Rachel. But I think I do now. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was feminine, careful, and heartbreakingly familiar to anyone who'd ever received a note from their mother. "My dearest daughters," Amanda read aloud. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to your father and me. Charles suspected that Nathaniel Brooks would never let us expose his crimes, and he made me promise to write this letter just in case." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Their mother had known. Somehow, Diane Cooper had known what was coming. "The evidence your father gathered is hidden in the conservatory, in the piano's secret compartment. The one Charles built when you girls were babies. Nathaniel can take our lives, our building, our dreams, but he cannot take the truth. Find each other. Find the evidence. Make him pay for what he's done." The letter was signed simply, "With all my love, Mama." The room was completely silent for a long moment. Then Danielle spoke, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "He still has the conservatory building. According to public records." "Yes," Lucas confirmed. "It's been converted to luxury condos, but the main performance hall is still intact, including the piano. The building's sales brochure mentions original period details preserved for historical significance," Stanley said. "I think there's a very good chance your mother's evidence is still exactly where she left it." Rachel stood, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "Then that's where we're going tonight." "Rachel, that's incredibly dangerous," Amanda protested. "If Nathaniel suspects, then we make sure he doesn't suspect until it's too late." Rachel looked at each of her family members in turn. "Our parents died trying to stop him. Our mother made sure we'd have the tools to finish what they started. I think it's time we honored their memory. The private clinic in upstate New York was a fortress of glass and steel hidden among rolling hills, its modern architecture designed to blend seamlessly with the landscape." Rachel pressed her face against the car window as they approached, her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. The revelation had come just hours earlier, delivered with Nathaniel's characteristic cruelty as his final card in a game he was rapidly losing, when confronted with the evidence they'd retrieved from the conservatory's hidden compartment, documents that proved his guilt beyond any doubt. He'd smiled that cold, predatory smile and dropped his bombshell. "You want to know the truth about your family?" he'd said, his pale eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. "Your mother didn't die in that accident. She's been my insurance policy for 15 years. Now, as they walked through the clinic's sterile corridors flanked by Lucas and Stanley, Rachel felt like she was moving through a dream. Amanda walked beside her, her face pale but determined, while Danielle brought up the rear, her phone ready to record whatever they might find. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the clinic's director, met them at the nurses' station. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the gentle manner of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. "Mrs. Brooks contacted me this morning about your situation," she said carefully. "I want you to understand that we've been caring for Jane Doe, the patient you know as Diane Cooper, for 15 years. Her care has been exemplary, but her condition—" "What exactly is her condition?" Stanley asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Traumatic brain injury resulting in a persistent vegetative state. There have been no signs of consciousness since she was admitted. Mr. Brooks's instructions were very specific. Maintain life support indefinitely, allow no visitors, and contact no one about her presence here." Rachel felt her legs threaten to give out. 15 years. Their mother had been alive for 15 years, trapped in silence while they grieved her death. "Can we see her?" Amanda asked quietly. Dr. Warren nodded. "Room 247. But please understand, while we've maintained hope, the likelihood of any meaningful recovery after this length of time is negligible," Danielle finished. "We understand." The room was peaceful, filled with afternoon sunlight that streamed through large windows overlooking the clinic's gardens. Medical equipment hummed quietly in the background, monitoring vital signs that had remained steady for a decade and a half. And there, in the center of it all, lay their mother, Diane Cooper looked smaller than Rachel remembered, her face peaceful but thin, her once vibrant auburn hair now streaked with silver. Machines breathed for her, fed her, kept her alive in the most clinical sense of the word. But she was alive. "Mama," Amanda whispered, approaching the bed with tentative steps. Rachel moved to the other side of the bed, her eyes tracing the familiar features that had haunted her dreams for years. Diane's hands lay still on top of the blankets, the same elegant fingers that had once braided Rachel's hair and helped her with piano practice. "The nurses say that some coma patients can hear what's happening around them, Doctor," Warren said gently. "We encourage family members to talk, to play music, to maintain connection even when there's no visible response." Music. Rachel's eyes met Amanda's across their mother's still form, and she saw her own thought reflected there. "Doctor," Rachel said, "would it be possible to bring a keyboard in here? Something she could hear if she can hear anything at all." "I think that would be wonderful," Dr. Warren replied. "We have a small electric piano in our music therapy room. I'll have someone bring it in." 20 minutes later, Rachel sat at a small electronic keyboard positioned near her mother's bed. Her sisters flanked Diane's still form, each holding one of their mother's hands. Stanley and Lucas stood near the windows, their faces etched with 15 years of grief and desperate hope. "What should I play?" Rachel asked, her fingers hovering over the keys. "Play the song," Danielle said quietly. "The one that brought us all together, the one that started to break down his lies." Rachel nodded and began the opening notes of Corazón de Medianoche. The melody filled the room, soft and achingly beautiful, carrying with it all the love and loss and longing that her father had poured into its creation. This was the song that had exposed Nathaniel's crimes, the song that had reunited the Cooper sisters, the song that had started their journey home. As the music swelled toward the first crescendo, Rachel thought she saw something, a flutter of eyelids, a slight tightening of fingers around Amanda's hand. But the monitors showed no change, and Dr. Warren remained silent. She continued playing, moving through the complex middle section that spoke of obstacles overcome and love triumphant. In her mind, she could hear her father's voice explaining the story the music told, could see his hands demonstrating the fingering for particularly difficult passages. "She loved this song," Amanda said suddenly, her voice thick with tears. "I remember now. She used to hum it while she cooked dinner, while she helped us with our homework. It was her favorite. Dad wrote it for her," Rachel replied, never pausing in her playing. "He told me once that every note was a love letter." As she moved into the final movement, the triumphant celebration of love conquering all adversity, something changed in the room. It was subtle at first, a shift in the quality of the light, a change in the rhythm of the machines. Then, Doctor Warren stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the monitors. "Her heart rate is increasing," she said quietly. "Brain activity is showing more variation than we've seen in years." Rachel's fingers never faltered as she played the final, soaring notes of her father's masterpiece. The last chord hung in the air like a prayer, like a bridge between the world of the living and the place where Diane Cooper had been trapped for 15 years. And then, impossibly, miraculously, Diane's eyes opened. The room erupted in gasps and tears, but Rachel remained frozen at the keyboard, afraid that any movement might break the spell. Diane's gaze was unfocused at first, confused, as if she were trying to remember how to see. But slowly, her eyes began to track movement, to focus on faces. "Mama," Amanda whispered. Diane's head turned slightly toward the sound, and her lips moved as if trying to form words. No sound came, but her eyes, those familiar hazel eyes that all three daughters had inherited, were alert and aware. Dr. Warren was immediately at the bedside, checking responses, adjusting equipment, her professional demeanor barely concealing her amazement. "This is unprecedented," she murmured. "After 15 years, the chances of emergence from such a deep coma were essentially zero." "Music," Diane said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper but unmistakably present. "Charles, the music." Rachel felt tears streaming down her face as she reached for her mother's hand. "Mama, it's me. It's Rachel. We're all here. Me and Amanda and Autumn. We found each other." Diane's eyes moved to each of her daughters in turn, recognition dawning slowly but surely. "My girls," she whispered. "My 3 little girls." "Mama," Danielle said, her voice breaking. "We need you to tell us about Nathaniel Brooks, about what he did to you and Daddy. We have evidence, but we need your testimony." For a moment, Diane looked confused, as if trying to sort through memories that had been locked away for a decade and a half. Then her expression hardened with surprising strength. "The safe," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "In the conservatory. Behind the piano, Charles. Charles hid everything there. The evidence, the recordings, the proof of what Nathaniel did. We found it, Mama," Rachel said gently. "We found everything, but Nathaniel told us you were dead. We've been grieving you for 15 years. Diane's face crumpled with anguish. He said he would kill you if I ever tried to contact anyone. Said he would know if I tried to escape, if I tried to tell anyone the truth, so I stayed silent. I let him keep me here, let him use me as leverage, because I thought it would keep you safe. You did keep us safe," Amanda said firmly. "But now it's our turn to protect you, to get justice for what he did to our family." Dr. Warren stepped forward. "I need to run some neurological tests, but it appears that Mrs. Cooper has made a remarkable recovery. Her cognitive function seems largely intact, though there may be some gaps in memory." "Doctor," Stanley said from his position by the window, "how quickly can Mrs. Cooper be moved to a more secure location if the man responsible for her condition discovers that she's awake?" "I understand your concerns, Dr. E." Warren replied. "Given the circumstances you've described, I think patient safety is paramount. We can arrange for immediate transfer to a secure facility." Diane struggled to sit up, her movements weak but determined. "No more hiding," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I've been silent for 15 years. It's time Nathaniel Brooks learned that some people refuse to stay buried." As her mother spoke those words, Rachel felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. They had the evidence, they had the witnesses, and now they had the one person whose testimony could destroy Nathaniel's carefully constructed lies once and for all. The Cooper family was finally complete, and they were ready for the final confrontation. 6 months later, Rachel sat in the gallery of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse, watching as Nathaniel Brooks was led away in handcuffs. The man who had once commanded rooms full of New York's elite now looked diminished. His expensive suit wrinkled and his face etched with the defeat of someone who'd finally been outmaneuvered. The trial had been a media sensation, dubbed the piano murder case by reporters who seemed endlessly fascinated by the story of 3 sisters reunited by music and their quest for justice. Every day, the courthouse steps had been packed with cameras and journalists, all eager to capture the latest developments in what prosecutors called one of the most elaborate cover-ups in the city's history. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Martha Harrison asked, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "We have, Your Honor," replied the jury foreman, a middle-aged teacher from Queens who'd been visibly moved by Diane Cooper's testimony. Rachel felt Amanda squeeze her hand on one side, while Danielle gripped her shoulder from behind. Their mother sat in the front row, still recovering her strength but determined to see justice done. Stanley and Lucas flanked her protectively, both men looking older but somehow lighter than they had 6 months ago. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, how do you find guilty? On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, guilty. On the charges of fraud, bribery, and racketeering, guilty on all counts." Each guilty verdict hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Rachel watched Nathaniel's face remain impassive, but she saw the slight tremor in his hands as the full weight of his conviction settled over him. 15 years of careful planning, of covering his tracks and eliminating threats, had all come crashing down because he'd underestimated the power of a family determined to find the truth. The sentencing phase had been equally swift and decisive. Judge Harrison, clearly disgusted by the evidence that had been presented, imposed the maximum penalty allowed by law: life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 40 years on the ancillary charges. "Mr. Brooks," Judge Harrison said as she delivered the sentence, "you used your wealth and position to destroy innocent lives, to corrupt the system meant to protect citizens, and to evade justice for a decade and a half. The court finds that your crimes demonstrate a callous disregard for human life that warrants the most severe punishment available." As the bailiffs led Nathaniel away, he turned one last time to look at the Cooper family, His pale eyes found Rachel's across the crowded courtroom, and for just a moment, she saw something that might have been respect mixed with his hatred. "He's finally gone," Amanda whispered, her voice thick with tears. It's really over, but the aftermath of the trial had brought its own challenges. The revelation that Amanda had been married to her parents' killer had triggered a media frenzy that made her daily life nearly impossible. Paparazzi camped outside her penthouse. Reporters shouted questions whenever she appeared in public, and social media buzzed with conspiracy theories and amateur psychological analyses. "I can't stay in that apartment," Amanda had told her sisters the week after the verdict. "Every room reminds me of him, of the lies I was living. I need to start over completely." The solution had come from an unexpected source. The conservatory building that Nathaniel had stolen from their father was now legally theirs again, returned through court order along with substantial financial compensation from his seized assets. The luxury condos he'd built had been purchased by the city and demolished, leaving only the original performance hall and practice rooms that Charles Cooper had designed with such love and hope. "We could rebuild it," Danielle had suggested during one of their family meetings. "Turn it back into what Dad always wanted it to be, a place where music could flourish, where kids from any background could learn and grow." The idea had taken root quickly. Using Nathaniel's ill-gotten wealth against him felt like the perfect poetic justice, and all three sisters had thrown themselves into the project with enthusiasm that surprised even them. Rachel found herself serving as the conservatory's artistic director, her natural musical gifts finally finding their proper outlet. She'd started taking piano lessons again, relearning pieces she'd forgotten, and discovering new composers whose work spoke to her evolving understanding of music's power to heal and transform. Amanda had proven to have a genius for administration and fundraising, skills honed during her years navigating New York's social elite. She'd legally changed her name back to Amanda Cooper and threw herself into the work of turning their father's dream into reality. Danielle, with her legal background and investigative skills, handled the complex bureaucratic challenges of running a non-profit organization. She'd also started a side practice helping other families who'd been victimized by corrupt officials and powerful criminals, using the investigative techniques she'd perfected during her years infiltrating Nathaniel's organization. The Cooper Conservatory for Musical Arts had its official ribbon-cutting ceremony exactly 1 year after Nathaniel's conviction. The mayor attended, along with dozens of music teachers, community leaders, and families eager to enroll their children in the programs. But the moment that mattered most came that evening. When the conservatory held its inaugural concert, the performance hall had been restored to its original beauty, with warm wood paneling and acoustics that made even whispered conversations sound like music. Diane Cooper, fully recovered now, and looking more like her old self every day, sat in the front row. Betty was beside her, the two women having become close friends as they shared stories of the daughters they'd both helped raise. Stanley and Lucas occupied the seats of honor, both men beaming with pride at what the Cooper family had accomplished. On stage, a new piano, a concert grand that had been donated by one of the conservatory's supporters, gleamed under the warm stage lights. This instrument held no painful memories, no associations with trauma or loss. It was simply a piano, waiting to make music. Rachel walked onto the stage, no longer the frightened young woman who'd been forced to perform for Nathaniel's cruel entertainment. She wore a simple black dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, and when she smiled at the audience, it was with genuine joy rather than nervous apprehension. "Tonight's concert is dedicated to the memory of Charles and Diane Cooper," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "My parents believed that music had the power to heal, to unite, and to transform lives. This conservatory is their legacy, and every note played here honors their memory." She took her seat at the piano and placed her hands on the keys. The scar on her left palm was still visible, but it no longer felt like a mark of trauma. Instead, it had become a reminder of survival, of the long journey that had brought her family back together. The first piece was Corazón de Medianoche, performed exactly as her father had written it. But this time, the music wasn't a weapon or a revelation or a desperate cry for justice. It was simply music, beautiful and pure, flowing from her hands like water from a spring as the familiar melody filled the hall. Rachel saw tears in her mother's eyes, pride in her grandfather's face, love in her sister's expressions. The music connected them all, just as it had connected the broken pieces of their family story into something whole and beautiful again. The final piece of the evening was something entirely new, a composition Rachel had been working on for months. Inspired by their journey from tragedy to triumph, she'd titled it Las Tres Lunas, the Three Moons, in honor of the crescent scars that had helped identify the Cooper sisters and bring them home. As the last notes faded into silence, the audience rose as one in thunderous applause, but Rachel barely heard it. Rachel. She was looking at her family, at the people who'd never stopped believing that the truth would eventually surface, that love could conquer even the most carefully constructed lies. 2 years after Nathaniel Brooks's conviction, the Cooper Conservatory had become exactly what Charles Cooper had dreamed it would be, a vibrant hub of musical education that served children from every corner of New York City. The restored building hummed with activity from dawn to dusk, filled with the sounds of young voices learning scales, tentative fingers finding melodies, and the occasional triumphant performance of a piece finally mastered. Rachel stood in the main performance hall, adjusting the microphones for the evening's special concert. Tonight marked not just another performance, but a celebration of everything their family had overcome and built together. The auditorium was already filling with familiar faces: students, parents, teachers, and supporters who'd watched the conservatory grow from a dream into a thriving reality. "The flowers look beautiful," Amanda said, entering from the side door with her arms full of programs. She'd been working since sunrise to ensure every detail was perfect, her natural organizational skills now channeled into something that brought joy rather than merely maintained appearances. Rachel smiled, remembering how different Amanda had looked 2 years ago, perfectly groomed but hollow-eyed, trapped in a life that had been built on lies. Now her sister radiated genuine happiness, her face animated as she discussed enrollment numbers or upcoming fundraising events. "Any word from the Times reviewer?" Danielle asked, appearing from backstage with her usual efficient energy. As the conservatory's executive director, she'd managed to secure coverage from major media outlets for tonight's concert, not because of their tragic past, but because of the institution they'd built. "She's already here," Amanda replied. "Front row, third seat from the left, and she looks impressed by the pre-show student performances." The evening's program was ambitious, a showcase featuring students from ages 6 to 18, followed by a special performance of Charles Cooper's complete works, many of which had never been heard publicly before. Rachel had spent months preparing, not just her own performances, but coaching the younger students who would share the stage with her. As showtime approached, Rachel found herself in the small practice room that had become her sanctuary. The walls were lined with photographs from the conservatory's early days, including one of her father at this very piano, his face bright with the joy of making music. Beside it hung a more recent photo, the 3 Cooper sisters at the conservatory's ribbon cutting, their mother standing proudly between them. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Diane Cooper entered, moving with the grace that had returned gradually as her health improved. She'd thrown herself into the conservatory's mission with the fervor of someone making up for lost time, teaching music theory to advanced students, and sharing stories of her late husband's compositions. "Nervous?" Diane asked, settling into the chair beside the piano. "A little," Rachel admitted. "It feels different tonight, more important somehow. Your father would be so proud," Diane said softly. "Not just of your playing, but of what you've all built here. This was always his dream. Music bringing people together, healing communities, creating something beautiful from pain." Through the practice room's window, they could see the main hall filling with audience members. Betty Morrison sat in her usual front row seat, her arthritis much improved thanks to the excellent medical care the conservatory's success had allowed them to afford. Stanley Prescott was nearby, engaged in animated conversation with Lucas Bryant about their latest project, a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. "There's something I want to tell you before tonight's performance," Diane continued. "Something I've been saving for the right moment." Rachel looked up from the keys, curious about her mother's suddenly serious tone. "Your father left something for each of you. Not just the music or the conservatory, but personal gifts. I hid them before the accident, and I've only recently felt strong enough to retrieve them." Diane pulled a small velvet box from her purse. "This was meant for you." Inside the box was a pendant in the shape of a crescent moon, made from silver and set with a small diamond. It was beautiful in its simplicity, but Rachel felt her breath catch as she recognized the design. "It matches your scar," Diane explained. "Your father had them made after the accident that gave you those marks. He said the scars weren't symbols of pain, but of survival, of the light that persists even in darkness." Rachel fastened the pendant around her neck, feeling the weight of it settle against her chest like a benediction. What about Amanda and Danielle? They'll receive theirs after tonight's performance. Each pendant is slightly different, reflecting each daughter's unique personality, but all are moons, because you three have always been the lights that guided our family through the darkest times. A gentle chime sounded through the building, indicating 5 minutes until showtime. Rachel embraced her mother, drawing strength from her presence and her words. The concert began with the youngest students, 6-year-olds playing simple melodies with the concentrated intensity that only children brought to important tasks. The audience watched with the warm appreciation of a community celebrating its own, applauding enthusiastically for every tentative note and small triumph. As the evening progressed through increasingly complex performances, Rachel felt the special magic that happened when music connected performers and audience in shared experience. These weren't professional musicians seeking fame or critical acclaim. They were neighbors, families, dreamers using music to express what words couldn't capture. Finally, it was time for the evening's centerpiece. Rachel walked onto the stage to warm applause, but this time she wasn't alone. Amanda and Danielle flanked her, taking seats at a second piano that had been wheeled onto the stage for this special performance. "Tonight," Rachel addressed the audience, "we're going to perform our father's final composition, Las Tres Lunas, the 3 Moons. He began writing this piece before his death, but never finished it. Over the past year, my sisters and I have collaborated to complete what he started, using themes and musical phrases we found in his notebooks. The piece began with a single piano, Rachel playing the opening movement that Charles had completed. It was achingly beautiful, a melody that spoke of love and hope and dreams deferred but not abandoned. The music painted pictures of moonlight on water, of quiet moments between parent and child, of faith in a future that seemed impossibly distant. As the first movement concluded, Amanda joined in with harmonies that transformed the melody into something richer and more complex. Her part represented the middle sister's journey, the confusion of lost identity, the struggle to find truth in a world built on lies, the gradual awakening to authentic love and purpose. Finally, Danielle's hands found their place on the keys, adding bass lines and rhythmic complexity that grounded the soaring melodies in strength and determination. Her musical voice spoke of justice pursued through long years of patient work, of the youngest sister's fierce protection of her family, of the satisfaction that came from seeing truth finally triumph over deception. Together, the 3 parts wove into something greater than the sum of their individual contributions. The music filled the hall with layers of meaning that spoke to everyone present, about family, about perseverance, about the power of love to survive even the most devastating losses. As they played, Rachel was aware of the audience's complete attention, but also of something deeper. She could feel her father's presence in the music, as if his spirit lived on in every note they played. This was his legacy, not just the compositions he'd written, but the family he'd raised, the values he'd instilled, the belief that music could make the world more beautiful. The final movement built to a crescendo that seemed to lift the entire building, notes cascading like silver water, and resolving into a harmony so perfect it felt like prayer. When the last chord faded into silence, the audience sat motionless for a heartbeat, before exploding into applause that went on for minutes. Standing at the piano with her sisters, Rachel felt the crescent pendant against her chest and thought about the journey that had brought them here. They'd lost so much. Years with their parents, childhood innocence, the simple certainty that the world was fundamentally safe and fair. But they'd also gained something precious, the knowledge that love could survive any tragedy, that truth would eventually surface no matter how deeply buried, and that music really could heal the deepest wounds. In the audience, Diane Cooper wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her 3 daughters take their bows. Behind her, the community they'd built applauded not just the performance, but everything it represented. The triumph of hope over despair, of love over hatred, of light over darkness. the Cooper family was whole again, and their music would echo through generations yet to come.